Alright, cool. Gonna get started. Um, Welcome back to GSC as always. So, as you probably know from the announcement and the big words right in front of you, today we're just gonna be going over game jams, particularly from the perspective of a sound person. Hopefully, providing a bit of insight that you can use for the upcoming GDSA game jam that's happening next weekend. So, yeah, let's get right into it. So I know there's going to be a lot of people,
This
especially
weekend.
this weekend.
Mm-hmm. It's the 8th.
This weekend,
The
This weekend.
8th.
you're a
This
blessing.
weekend.
All right, this weekend. So I know there's going to be a lot of people here, particularly the first years that probably haven't done a game jam before. So the idea of making a game in such a short time period can be kind of a daunting thing. So I just wanted to touch on some of the great things about game jams and a bit about them. Um, so they're pretty awesome. I personally love them. Most, I would say most of the people in the program that have done them love them. Um, but one of the great things about it, even if you don't think you're quite at the level yet that you think you should be at, there's only one way to get good at something, and that's by doing it. So participating in a jam, even if your game's an absolute mess at the end, and trust me, I know how that is. Uh, Ultimately, it's gonna help you, and at the end of the day, it'll be something you'll have a lot of fun with. And there's absolutely no harm in participating, so you might as well do it. Uh, and yeah, you can try out new things. You can try out different roles. Like I was an artist on one of them back then, and I've done sound for another one. Shockingly, I know, but yeah, you can experiment. You can try new things. It's just a good time. And for me at least, part of, or one of the best parts about game jams, other than the experience of actually doing it, is that it's kind of a microcosm of the entire game dev cycle. So all within the time frame of like 48 hours, 24 hours, a week, however long it is, you'll hopefully have gone through the ideas stage, the development of the content, and the asset production, the polish and bug fixing phases, and eventually releasing it. So beyond that, for each individual working on it, it'll show you a really tiny version of your workflow. So for artists, that could be concepting, modeling, or sculpting, texturing, rigging, and animating. And then, for us sound designers and composers, we'll be looking into that today. Um, Game jams also help you improve your skills, either by like really honing them by working away at something, or learning something entirely new, or by challenging yourself. Um, all Any way you decide to do it, it'll be a great way to improve because it's a really safe environment. Everyone has the same amount of time. Everyone's rushing to make something. So if you don't get the exact results you want, honestly, at the end of the day, it's fine. It's a safe place to experiment comfortably. And it's much better to do that in such a low stakes thing like a game jam than rather spend months on a project and realize at the end, maybe this wasn't a good idea. So, yeah, game jams are great for that as well. And a lot of people tend to get burnt out in the middle of a semester. I know I experienced that a lot. Um, so, doing a game jam is kind of a good way to revitalize that creativity in you. Um, and it lets you explore ideas that you might not have thought of otherwise. Um, and yeah, doing that can decompress a lot of built up stresses throughout the semester. So it's a really good idea for that as well. And this kind of falls under improvement, but game jams will improve your ability to prototype 100%. Getting a quick and dirty version of your game playable sooner rather than later is truly the key to success, and game jams expedite this entire process. Um, and the GDSA had a session last week about production and rapid prototyping was one of the things Hamraj brought up. So learning that from doing game jams, honestly, a great idea. And looking at it purely as an opportunity to market yourself, you can come out of a game jam having networked with a bunch of people, and if your game is good enough or if you're proud enough of it, it could be something to toss in your portfolio. And even if it's not the greatest, it's still worth putting on your portfolio, since it shows employers that you're passionate about developing games, you're willing to work with people, and it shows that you have the drive to participate and actually finish them. And last but not least, they're happening all the time. So finding one that fits your schedule, or even just finding something to do by doing one, is as easy as going to itch.io and looking at the jam calendar. And just there at the bottom, we got the two game jams I've participated in. We got Too Many Characters and Redacted Door, both of which we're probably going to talk about at some point. So let's move on. Real quick, just wanted to get this out of the way right off the bat. Everyone does jams differently, and that's the beauty of it. So a good chunk of what I'm going to get into today is how I've personally found it to be beneficial to work. So it could be completely different for you. I just wanted to share this to see if it helps you along, gets you to develop your workflow, that sort of thing. And I do want to notice as well that not all of this is directly aimed at sound people. Most of it is. So even if you're not a sound person per se, I'm sure you'll come away with something from this one. So you're signed up for a game jam, you got a team. Now what do you do? And the short version is you do as much prep as possible beforehand to maximize your time of actually doing the fun part. So what does that mean? This might be my Sigma grind set talking, but if you go into a game jam with a clear goal in mind, you're a lot more likely to come out of it feeling more accomplished than you would otherwise. And it gives you something to work on or towards, and through that, it makes you feel like you're accomplishing something as it goes on. It could be something as simple as wanting to learn a new program, or wanting to learn one better, or maybe experiment with genres that you've never tried before. That could be game genres, music genres, whatever. Or something more difficult, like something music related, like wanting to write something that's super adaptive and never the same twice, or really anything you want. If you put your mind to it and write it down, there's a pretty good chance that you'll focus on working towards completing that goal. And just a quick example of Too Many Characters, the first jam game I did, that was back in second year. And the concept of that was basically just a 2D shooter, but the gimmick there was that there's just a ridiculous amount of characters from pretty much every property you can think of, and all of them were using the same model for the most part, so it was pretty funny. But I spent the majority of that jam, being an artist, I was learning Substance Painter. So since I had to make textures for like 20 something characters on one model that I made in the first day, I came out of it a little less sane, but I learned how to use Substance Painter pretty decently. So if you spend the majority of a jam doing one thing, if it's something new, you'll learn something through that, and it's a good way to learn, I'd say. This is a big one. If you start the jam needing to install a new Unity version or update everything, uh, quite honestly, that's a bit of a waste of time, even if you're doing the idea generating in that time. Just making sure everything's up to date and downloaded is pretty important to making sure that ship sails smoothly right after leaving the dock. And of course, have breaks, have time away from your desk, screens, computer, all of it. And I know that kind of seems counterintuitive when you have such a short window of time to make a game. But taking regular breaks is ridiculously important, not just for your health, but also for productivity. So as much as you want to sit down and grind for 36 hours straight, you'd be just as productive, if not significantly more productive, in 12 hours if you just pace yourself properly, take breaks to eat, walk around, stretch, take a nap, all that good stuff you gotta do. Um, so if you set timers to go off like every hour or two, and then just take like 15 minutes to stretch, walk around, um, go touch grass maybe, uh, even just going for a short walk or something, all that's a really good way to make sure that you're taking proper breaks and can rejuvenate your creativity if you hit a brick wall. And yeah, definitely sleep. I've done game jams where I just didn't sleep. The Too Many Characters jam in particular, I remember I think I had 4 Red Bulls in one night, and then I went to work, and then my boss literally told me that I looked terrible. So he sent me back to the school, and I just slept on a table or something like that. So definitely sleep. You will feel it. Um, and even if you don't feel it, your productivity will hurt. So there's that. And yeah, so that's everything before the jam. And then you got everything updated. You got a goal for the jam. You got enough timers to make the Olympics jealous. And it is jam day. You got your team in a call. And the theme was just announced. What now? How do you get started? So, generally speaking, right after the theme's announced, that's when teams go headfirst into thinking of game ideas. And honestly, that is the best place to start. So, being the audio people, or really any discipline you fall under, ensure that as this is going on and as ideas are being written down, that you're thinking about what your role is going to be. So, for sound, you're going to be thinking, okay, what's the soundscape of each game going to be like? Uh, all the things that might need sounds, all that good stuff. So, taking note of that as each of these ideas are popping up and kind of getting more and more solidified, that can really help you with tying it into your personal goals for the jam, and at the same time help you achieve them in a way that fits the game perfectly. So once you got the idea agreed across team members, that's when more planning happens. At this point, what I'd say is probably the best course of action is to start making deliverable lists. So this includes stuff like how much music you'll need and where it'll play, what actions will have sound effects and how many, the various visual assets like models, textures, animations, and all the gameplay deliverables that are specific to your game. So like a functioning grapple hook or a gravity gun, whatever your mechanics are, that's what it'll fall under, and that's where it'll be tracked. So doing so can help keep the scope in your heads at all times and can really get it to a workable place. Um, we're gonna expand a bit on scope in a slide or two. Um, but the great thing about a deliverable list is that it really acts as a checklist. So as you make progress, you can see things getting checked off, visually showing the progress you've made. And to go back to too many characters briefly, we had a giant list of names of just characters. um, and we got through most of them. There was like 50 something originally, but we got through about 30 or 40, I want to say. Um, so just having a list of what you want to do can really help you achieve it faster, because that way you're not trying to remember, okay, what do I need to do now? And you just got it right in front of you. So it's good to see progress there, and it helps. Um, Next up, leaving time for each stage of production is insanely important in a game jam, and you don't really want to be scrambling to get something playable in the last 10 minutes. So roughing out how much time you want to spend in certain areas is a pretty great idea to help reduce the impending stress of the time limit being reached. I'd say that for a 48-hour jam, it's pretty reasonable and a good idea to have the initial concepting and pre-production, if you want to call it that, phase that includes all the planning and stuff. All that done within the first 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours max. And then rapid prototype as soon as you can. Another thing Hamrosh talked about last week. And then by the 44-hour mark ish, like with a couple hours left, have something that's more or less content complete. So that'll give you a few hours to bug fix, to polish things up, and to get it ready for uploading. And then around the 46, 47-hour mark, that's when I'd say you should be uploading the most up-to-date and polished version you got, and then get your page looking good. And last but not least, for starting off, please, please, please keep your scope down. I know I talked about scope literally at the start of this slide. I'm talking about it again. But yeah, take out literally anything that does not need to be there. And I can already see y'all memeing about it, being like, oh, so music and sound don't need to be there. But seriously, scoping down your game to be or to get it down to the bare essentials is the way to go for having something finished by the end of the jam. So when you're figuring out what the game is, having wants and needs distinguished on your deliverable list can really help you narrow that down. I cannot speak.
You good? Can you talk?
I'm good. I Struggle.
Can you say deliverable list 5 times fast?
Deliverable list, deliverable list. I can't do it. That's too much. That kind of hurt. All right. So pre-production is over. Moving into production. You got a list of stuff to make and about 46 hours, 45 hours left to make it happen. Here's the real meat and potatoes in the of the session and of the jam. So, I told you we'd be talking about scope, so here it is. Even when you've begun working on stuff, like even when you're at the third day of the game jam, second day of the game jam, you've been working on stuff, keep scoping down. Uh, find out what you really need and deliver that and polish it. Keep it as tight as possible, and that's how you're gonna get something done. So, alright, so scope, right? Let's start off by keeping the scope of the music down, right? So obviously this will vary greatly from game to game, but aiming for like one track or one loop is a pretty good bar, since that's kind of the bare minimum to have music in your game. So having a few parts that mix up and get randomized on each loop can be a good way to keep it fresh and make it a bit more dynamic, uh, rather than just one loop for the entire game. But obviously, that's expanding on the scope. That's taking it from like 4 times magnification to like 16. So be careful with how you do this. You definitely don't want to make the scope go too big. Um, yeah, it's 48 hours. You don't want it to be big. Alright, so then you got sound effects. Like with any game, the most important sounds that the player must hear should be prioritized. Getting the sounds that the player hears often, done very well, is a necessary step in any game. But with game jams, since they generally have a pretty sparse soundscape due to the short time, these should be done first and they should be done well. Then and only then should you even think about moving on to sounds that are less important, um, or the want to have sounds. So if you get the need to have sounds done first, make sure they're great. Then you move on to the highest priority want to have sounds to spice it up a little more. Um, and you'll probably notice I didn't put voice in here, and that's for a pretty good reason. Voiceover isn't super common in game jams, and um, but because of that, by no means should this dissuade you from throwing in some voice stuff if you want to. Feel free to. There's no rules against that, usually. But again, I would treat it like sound effects in that you should prioritize it properly, make sure that it's the highest quality you can deliver in such a short time. But at the same time, try not to spend too much time on it, ensuring it's perfect. And speaking of which, during game development, it's super easy to get in the mindset, or grind set if you will, that things need to be perfect or the best you can possibly make. But especially for game jams, that's not the case. So just keeping it high quality, but at the same time, reaching the MVP, another thing Hamrush talked about, the minimum viable product. Keeping your eyes on that, as opposed to perfection, is a lot more effective for productivity. And right at the bottom, once again, breaks, take breaks, account for them in your scope, and you'll be a happy camper. So, with the scope actually out of the way now, let's get into asset production and pipelines, because that stuff's fun. So for music, I'm pretty much building all of this off of the last game jam I did, which was that one game, Redacted Door, that I mentioned at the beginning, which I went into with the goal of making like a synth wave, or at least something fairly electronic and vibey. So the first thing I did, I found reference work. I looked up a bunch of chill wave, ambient, synthy kind of stuff, and found that video right there. Listened to it about, or listened to the beginning bits a couple times. Found what I was looking for, so I pinned the tab, kept it open, and then I got to work. Another great idea for this step is listening to sample packs and construction kits, because you can download those And most of them have loops that you can build off of for inspiration, so that's a pretty good idea as well. And then after I got some reference work to be inspired from, and kind of draw some inspiration from, that's when you get the instruments out. So I started by just going through a bunch of synth presets, playing a few notes, and if I liked it, I kept it, and then I added another one. I ended up using a couple FL Studio synths. I used Flex and Harmor a lot for pretty much all of the synth work I used, since they just have a ridiculous amount of variety with their presets. But that's where I landed mostly. So from there, I just kept adding the necessary things after getting the main melody synth. So a couple bass synths, some super high ones, some mids, some ambient pads, and then I added some percussion. Next thing I knew, pretty solid selection to draw from that covered the entire soundscape. So generally with the instruments, what I try to do is I start with the melody, and then from there be like, okay, I'll add the bass, I'll add the percussion, I'll add any additional kind of ambient pads in the background. And that's just how my process works for music. For the most part, whether it's synths, guitar, piano, whatever it is. So I found that working. It could work for you. Hopefully it does. And if not, hopefully you find something and share it, because I'd love to know. So once you got the colors on your palette, it's time to start painting. So usually I write by just picking a chord and start noodling with it. So that's exactly what I did. And once something sounded decent, I would either program it in the sequencer or record it, and then just tweak it as necessary, and then boom, something to build off of. And as you can see, it flip-flops between noodling and mixing, which is what I do, and what I've heard a lot of the pros do as well. So just kind of mixing as you go, and as you write and build your track, and that'll make the process a lot easier when you get to the end for the final mix. So you've noodled a lot, you've mixed as you went along, you noodled with the bass down low, you noodled with the high stuff, and cool, you got everything good. And you likely found that you didn't use all the instruments you built up, or you didn't need enough, or you didn't have enough, rather. I really can't speak today, holy. So that's when you cut things out. Save yourself some time and some processing power. Any unused plugins that you have loaded up and you don't need, you could just take them off, because you in your sleep deprived state could be tweaking the volume of your 16th synth preset you loaded up, not hearing a difference, only to find out that it's literally not even used. So that being said, you should also listen through the track, see if there's anything that doesn't need to be there, or if something's missing. Yeah, and from there, either take it out, throw something new in. But at the same time, repurposing parts is a great idea if you like it, if you think it's good, and it's something I would highly recommend. So I wouldn't just say outright delete patterns, but be conscious and self-aware enough if whether or not it should be in there. And if you're not sure, that's when you screen share, that's when you export, that's when you send it to your team, and get some feedback. And usually a good thing that Game Jam Discords have, the GDSA server will probably have this, since they did last year, but a work in progress kind of channel, or a feedback channel. So if you send your stuff in there, no matter what discipline you're in, that can help you out. So once the project's cleaned up and you got a nasty track that's ready to be served up, just leave it in the oven a little bit longer for some final mixing. So this is where you ensure everything's panned correctly, the volume of everything is where you want it to be, and all the crazy wacky effects you want to throw on it are on. And if you've been doing this as you go, it shouldn't be crazy difficult or long, but the final mixing is all that like last tweaking that goes and takes the track to the next step. And once that's done and in a good spot, then you'll move on to mastering. And essentially, in such a quick process like this, mastering just basically means getting the volume set to a good level, the overall EQ being solid and balanced, and then ensuring that the track is game ready. So after all that's done, here's where the game specific part comes in, getting it chopped up. in the case of adaptive music, and more broadly, getting it loopable. So I use FL Studio. The great thing about FL Studio is that its export window has a function where you can actually wrap the reverb tails to the beginning of the track, which is great, but it can only do so much. So a good idea is having the start and the end of the track kind of loop in the playlist of your DOS. So like having the last bar, put that right before the first bar, and then the last bar you just copy your first bar, slap it at the end. So that way when you export that, you could just chop off the beginning and end, um, and then boom, it's something that you can loop seamlessly without worrying about the reverb tails. So it's a little bit more time consuming than just exporting and clicking the wrap option, but that is an option you have. And a lot of other DAWs do have the wrap functionality as well, but I use FL Studio. I'm going to say FL Studio. So now that it's done and game ready, you just got to slap it in FMOD, or Wise, or Unity's audio engine, whatever you're using. You just got to slap it in there. So using FMOD and Unity as the example, you slap it in the timeline, add a loop, and a couple of parameters if you want it changing at all, and then multi-instruments where you want it randomized a bit. So right there in the bottom right, super basic and empty example of FMOD that I whipped up. You got a couple loops there with the blue little brackets, and the second one, it's got a multi-instrument in there in case there was a couple loops, and then there's the progress parameter that can switch between the two. Super basic, but it can be honestly as simple as just one track with a loop over top of it. After that, you hit the good old build button, move the banks and project over to the Unity folder, and tape it together to the FMOD plugin, and slap that event into an empty game object, set it to play on object start, and you're laughing. And boom, super quick and dirty music pipeline. Now let's move over to the world of sound effects. And I need a quick sip of my hot chockey because I cannot breathe. Ooh, it's good stuff. So, like I kind of said before, figuring out what sounds you actually need in the first place is pretty integral to having a decent soundscape. So if your game functions perfectly without sound effects, awesome, but I'm willing to bet that's probably not going to be the case for the vast majority of jam games. So look long and hard at the mechanics you've got in your game and think about what really needs a sound to play and what sort of noise it'll make. So all this should be done in the pre-production phase, but I wanted to just touch on it again. To be super clear that games are kind of an ongoing thing, especially jams, and can change at a moment's notice, so just keeping on top of that is a good idea to keep in mind. So once you got a list of what you're going to need, that's when the 3 different paths open up to you. So the first path you got is the root of libraries. So this could be either a library of your own stuff that you've recorded, it could be things you've downloaded, it could be stuff that you just pulled off of the internet, anything really. So either way, great resources for getting what you want quickly. Then you got the next path you can take, which is authoring a sound yourself. And by authoring, what I mean is using synths and tone generators along with a bunch of effects to really nail down exactly what you want. This can be a little daunting for some sounds that may be a bit more complex, but it's an option nonetheless if you find yourself interested in that kind of aspect of sound design. And the third path is good old-fashioned recording. So for a game jam, I'd say that you probably shouldn't be going to a remote location 3 hours away to do a bunch of field recording, but instead doing stuff like just recording what you have nearby, like jangling some keys or like smacking an empty bottle or anything around your room that you can use for some cool sounds, or honestly just any sounds that you could use. So after collecting your sounds, the next step I'd say would be to layer things for more complex sounds. Again, you don't want to go overboard and take ages to find out that it was perfect on its own all along. But layering sounds, especially if they're from libraries, can give them a bit more of your own touch, and it can really make them seem a bit more fitting for your game. And this goes kind of hand in hand with layering, but then you've also got editing. This would be slapping any effects on it, getting it to sound just right, tweaking the EQ and volume levels, and then eventually mastering it by making sure that the volume checks out across all of them. And this is also the step where you would trim off any empty space at the beginning and end, just to make it as small of a file as possible. So now that you got it game ready, same process as with the music. You get it exported, you slap her into FMOD, and smack that build button and move the banks over. And then you either trigger it through scripting or an event emitter component on a game object. So, and then this process can repeat anywhere really, at any of these steps, but it's probably just the best idea to implement all of them at once instead of going one by one if you're able to. That way it's just significantly easier on you and you're not constantly being like, okay, build, move the 2 folders with 1 change, and then implement that one, and then keep going. That way it's just kind of segmented in steps, I guess. And with Redacted Door again, here's just a quick example of the FMOD project for the last game jam I did. So all those referenced events under the music folder, those are just in this big music event. So all those, they're just the different sections of one big track, just chopped up to fit the different levels. And as you can see, there's literally only 5 sound effects in the entire game. I narrowed them down to the absolute bare minimum, slapped them in, and it ended up working out pretty well. So you've made the music and a bunch of sounds, got it in the game, they work, cool. So what now? Now it is the time to make it even better. So, oh my god, I forgot I put that joke in there. Yeah, you thought we were done with mixing? No, we're not. Mixing will never end, but instead of mixing the music to a good level or bringing all the sounds up to the same volume, this time it's opening up the FMOD mixer, which I took a bit of a screenshot there, and mixing everything together in the game. So that's when you just basically listen back to everything, make sure, okay, this sound effect doesn't overpower the music doesn't overpower everything. Cool, just figuring out, cool, what level should everything be at, and that's when it sounds good. So the polish phase is also where you get to revisit some of the sounds that aren't quite as pog the 300th time listening to it. That was a sentence I just said. At the same time, try to get any feedback where you can once it's in the game, because having the sound on its own is one thing, but presenting it in the context that it'll actually be used will show if it works well or not. So again, go to feedback channels, ask your teammates, be like, hey, does this sound like garbage? Does this sound like wet garbage? Does it sound decent? Let me know. And this is where you can go back, kind of change up some weaker sounds, maybe swap them out for something else, and just see what works. And let's say you really want to emphasize something in the game. Boom, just slap a sidechain compressor in FMOD, hook the sound up to a compressor, and then stick it on the music or whatever other sound you want, and there you go, you got a bit of emphasis, some assembly required, but that's a possibility. FMOD is super versatile in that regard, and it's super easy to work with. You don't need to do a ton of really crazy programming or anything. It's really just as simple as adding a couple effects. So there's also the ability to add contextual reverb and stuff, tweak EQ settings through sidechain compression, a whole world of making really cool decisions and a lot of really cool mixing possibilities at your fingertips with the FMOD mixer. This entire club, I'm realizing, is just one giant advertisement for FMOD, which honestly I'm okay with. But yeah, the mixer is really great. I wish I used it earlier. Because as you can tell, nothing here was mixed. But like I said, it ended up turning out okay-ish in the end. So in tandem with all this, you should have something playable by this point. So if you hook it up to FMOD using Live Update to kind of experiment and mix as you play, this will really improve what you do. So basically, what Live Update is it uses networking to connect your FMOD client to the running Unity client. Um, and that way you can mix in real time. You can swap out sounds in real time if you really wanted to. And then it'll update it live, as you could expect from the name. Um, so it's awesome. I genuinely do not know what I would do without this. And I'm probably going to do a session on it in the future, so stay tuned for that. Um, but yeah, absolutely take advantage of Live Update. It's an incredible resource to have, and it makes everything infinitely more productive and easy. And while you're making sure everything's solid, be sure to listen back to it with a variety of different setups. So whether it's your studio monitors, whether it's built-in speakers on your TV or computer monitor or laptop, your headset, some cheapo dollar store headset or dollar store earbuds or something, or just your regular earbuds that you use to listen to stuff with, anything you can get your hands on, listen back to it on. Um, Honestly, the more you listen back through, the better idea of where to make the tweaks you'll have moving forward. So that can really help you with the mixing process. And once everything's up to snuff and you're down to the last hour or so, the game should be submitted, and any last minute tweaks should be made by then. So anything you need to go back and check, this is the absolute last chance to do it. Because after that, the game's submitted, the jam's over. And it's submitted, you're exhausted. That's pretty much the entire cycle of development right there in a 48-hour time span that you just went through. What next? So this is when you play other games, reap the awards of having worked on this all weekend, see other people play your games, and play other people's games to get them the same feeling that you're getting. Because honestly, that's a good chunk of the fun. And just seeing people play your game or seeing other hard work that people have done can pay off just as much as hitting that submit button. And if you're really proud of your work, you can upload the tracks to SoundCloud or Bandcamp and add it to your portfolio, like I said near the beginning. And you can rest, hopefully remaining hydrated and fed throughout, and without losing too much sleep, because you've made a game. That's something to celebrate. It's pretty cool. And that is it. I cannot breathe. Thanks for coming out. So as you know, next week is reading week. And the GSA is hosting the Game Jam this weekend on October the 8th is the first day. Do not miss it. I'm going to be there. A bunch of people are going to be there. It'll be a good time. And yeah, we'll see you for our next session in 2 weeks' time.